Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of a series of In Conversations With for Montash's AIOP service, where we explore how private equity firms can bring value creation through AI and through data. My first guest is Mr. Alistair Ramage, who brings a wealth of expertise within the sector, commencing his career with EY, consulting on commercial transformation. As of recent, he's been working with a number of private equity firms on value creation through data and AI. Alistair, hi.
So Hugo, thanks for the intro. My background, 25 years of corporate transformation. I spent a dozen years in management consulting, developing a lot of propositions, people like EY, outsourcing global service lines and those sorts of things. I then spent about a dozen years working as an interim, and more of that time has been with private equity, and really exclusively since 2020 on AI value creation. And during that time, I have done AI work with what I would consider all the major domains. So novel business models, customer and revenue, so things like personalization and pricing, with operational efficiency, so cost out, process efficiency, intelligent automation, ESG, some interesting things in terms of brand positioning and carbon and global mining, with governance, and automating things like cross-border flows of regulated goods and improving controls, always a hot topic as IPOs loom. And finally, with assets, a lot of value in things like asset digital twins and machine vision and related. Great to be here. Very interested to hear your questions and respond where I can.
Perfect. Thank you, Al. Look, both you and I know the importance of the work you're doing, but it'd be great to get more insight from your side on why value creation is so important for private equity firms.
Yeah, look, I mean, everywhere you look at the moment, AI is being discussed, being hyped, frankly, and I think the impact to private equity is particularly interesting. So on the one hand, we've got a market with some real issues. There have, for the last couple of years, certainly since 23, been pretty weak exits, few IPOs, obviously a much higher cost of capital than through the 2010s. I think one of the lurking problems in the market is how many PE firms have exited from one of their funds to another, which is not really a brilliant moment to crystallize value. And the suggestion, and of course none of the evidence is in the public domain, the suggestion is that that's stored up a load of issues across portfolios, which are now being exposed through weak economics in the market, whether that's the US effect on global trade or whether it's the UK effect of reducing confidence in the economy and jobs out. But probably the most interesting thing in this space is AI is driving radically quicker marketplace changes. And there are two really interesting consequences of that. One is that, frankly, the half-life of a company is just shrinking. There's quite long-term measured effects of that for things like FTSE 100, where the half-life of a company has been shrinking for a long time. But in the case of AI, each big new drop from someone like an OpenAI or Anthropic is starting to disrupt a whole load of particularly the venture capital ecosystem, where people had a bright idea, got some funding 18 months ago, and suddenly the next version of GPT or something just does it. I think the really sneaky thing going on there, and we'll go on to talk about data protection, is that high users of AI are often not very secure, and the AI companies can see the patterns in the data. And just as in the past, Amazon has taken over supply chains when there have been products that have been hot and hyped. We're starting to see AI development affected by usage patterns, so that if a company is getting hot, starting to accelerate the growth, that will move up the feature list for the next drop of big tech's AI. And so that natural evolution of company success and the sort of drop-off rate, in the past, PE would have bought, hold, and attempted to grow every company, whereas VC, venture capital, the old assumption was, 1 in 10 would be an absolute scorcher and generate return to cover the whole portfolio. We're starting, I think, to see private equity move a little bit more towards that venture capital model, where some of the businesses bought into will simply fail rather than be underwhelming exits. And that's switching risk in the market quite interestingly. All of that, of course, creates the challenge of, on the one hand, how do we use AI for value creation? And on the other hand, how do we make sure we stay ahead of the competition so that we're the successful company that's eating up the marketplace, not the slower to change company that's being disrupted by the marketplace? It's a very, very interesting time, and I suspect it's only going to get more interesting.
Yeah, and look, that makes complete sense. So in the market so far, what have you seen work personally, and why do you think that has worked?
So I tend to look at AI in 6 domains, if you like. There are disruptive business models where you're bringing, I mean, something like Uber disrupted the taxi market by taking a platform view. There are opportunities to do the same with AI, kind of arbitrage of people and personalization. Most of the value coming out of AI is the more humdrum, normal stuff sitting in one of 5 areas, either customer and revenue, and personalization. We'll come back and talk about that as a huge theme. Operational excellence and supply chain. So this is process automation, its efficiency, its productivity gains. There's quite a lot. In fact, the whole ESG market is almost entirely unaddressable without big data. So for organisations that are starting to prioritise brand on things like carbon and performance or inclusivity, you've got to have big data at the heart of that to just demonstrate what's going on as a basic audit. Governance, I've delivered a few interesting things, particularly around cross-border, so things like pharmaceuticals, where there's a huge amount of paperwork to move regulated product around the world. Automating that is a massive cost saving and a quality enhancement. And then the last of those areas is assets, where typically digital twins, whether it's machine vision being used in mining to better detect when you've got a safety incident or a tooth drops off a bucket at the front end of the mining process, historic cause of lots of downstream problems, or things like asset optimization, jet engines, water companies, and so on. When can you predict the maintenance, improve asset uptime, reduce disruption? And I think the common thread in nearly all of those is treating AI not as a technology opportunity, but starting from the vantage point of business. And if the board is going to get excited by this stuff and lead this stuff, then it's going to pull through action further down. Whereas if you leave in a conventional company the tech team to push it at the company, typically people push back. So I think lesson 1, don't treat AI as a tech innovation. Look at the real opportunities that come out of business improvement. And of course, in private equity, where cash flow is always king, those quick time to value operational efficiencies, the things that are going to generate a cash saving or an asset utilization or a customer bump, personalization and customer acquisition and marketing is a very good space to start. Then you're going to get a little bit of accretive cash, and that's going to allow you to start spending more risk on the more fun, more fruity things. And one of the themes we'll come back to time and time again is this idea of iteration, of incrementalism. Take something, what's the smallest thing you can do, quickest time to value, to use the phrase, that demonstrates it either works or it doesn't. And if it works, great, learn some lessons, advance, go to the next step. And if it doesn't work, take the lesson, try something else. Because AI is so different, the learning of how do you co-evolve, how do you develop business governance so that you can use it reliably, forces you to think in a sort of, I hate the phrase co-evolution, I've used it again, co-evolution, because the adoption of AI has to sit alongside workforce skills, governance and reliability. And that's not something you can open a box and go, ta-da, it works. Very interesting move in recent weeks to see OpenAI, massively invested, $1 trillion investments into turning large language models into a service through an API, suddenly go, shit, actually we need a lot of people. Effectively what big tech used to do, your Oracles, your SAPs, Salesforces, where's the systems integrator? Where's the people that can sit alongside the client company to work out how to adopt the tool and how to validate and prove the tool, the governance, alongside? AI and LLMs are sitting at the top of a bit of a value crash, I think. There's no way autocomplete, which is what it is, can be left to run a business without a human in the loop. So helping the human learn and adopt, and helping the board or risk committee or whoever else it is understand and approve and sign off is hugely important. And I think that's one of the reasons that particularly listed companies, typically lower risk taking, have been slower out of the gates on AI adoption than a lot of people expected. I think it's also a really interesting opportunity for private equity, because the control of risk, the length of decision controls and committees is just much shorter in private equity. So the right leadership with the right direction can take decisions and can get movement and momentum much quicker than a listed company in this space. It's a really key opportunity.
Definitely, and I've seen from a talent perspective myself, a lot of the private equity firms want to implement AI for value creation, just don't know where to start, who to start with. What would you say, Al, is a good starting point for private equity firms listening?
So I think there's two places to look. One is in the portfolio companies themselves. That's always easier because it's about directing change over there. The other place to look is use of, and I'm going to use the phrase big data, in the portfolio in the fund co itself or hold co. That's much harder because it forces private equity individuals to look in the mirror and challenge themselves to behave differently. And so, whilst the opportunities are vast in terms of deal sourcing and due diligence and decision optimization, it's generally easier, and it's also easier to get someone else to pay if you're doing that in a portfolio company. I wonder if we can just move on a slide, because there's a really core principle here, and of course the realization of that principle will depend on the company. The fastest and most assured path to value from modern data methods, AI, generative AI, is to use a majority of market data. That might be market data, it might be market tools like OpenAI or other products are available. And of course, the real value comes when you take a whole load of market available data that's already pre-assured, pre-validated, gather it together in a secure, data location, data lakehouse, data warehouse, and seed it with a little bit of in-house data. That is far quicker than going left to right and starting with all of my corporate data and making sure all of that corporate data is perfect. And so the really interesting take to answer your question is what drives value in the company? And of course, that's a very business question, and the answer is going to be different for every company. There are, and we'll come on to this in a moment, there are three really good routes in, I think. There are others. To how do you get value out of data in a company? The first, and we'll come to these in more detail in a moment, is about what I would call personalization. And you can apply personalization to lots of different things. You can apply it to customer questions, which customer, which marketing, or which customer, what price. But you can also apply it to staff. You don't just stick an ad on LinkedIn. You need to think much more carefully about, where is that person? What is it you're going to do to activate them? If they're really top talent, you're seeing this a lot with crazy salaries and AI talent. How do you develop your employer brand? That's a very personalization-driven question. I've also run personalization as an approach over things like assets and stock keeping units, so wholesale. Did some work a couple of years ago with a wholesaler who had quite a highly regulated product. I'll leave it at that. But 5.5 billion annual stock turn of product. And effectively what we did is we treated each of the stock keeping units, the product lines, as a customer, and said, for this type of customer, what's the right approach in terms of holding stock? Is it volatile? Do we need a bigger buffer of stock? Is it nationally drawn down, or is it only bought in particular locations? So where do we hold the stock across a set of warehouses, national warehouses, etc.? Personalization is vastly important, but of course the thing you mostly need is external market data. So of all my customers, of all the information I hold on my CRM system or customer data platform, that is a minute proportion of the data that is available compared to the market available data. If I can go and scrape social media, for instance, or B2B, I can go and scrape, and trivially, frankly, these days, you can go and scrape company reports. It takes you about 3 months to not toggle beyond the free use to ingest pretty much the whole of company's house. So if you want to, back to fund level, if you want to scour the entire UK market for companies that have a particular profile, well, ingest the whole of company's house and then just use data tools to scrape across that. And all of that comes time and time again to saying, well, what data exists? Which bits of that data do I know? The second really interesting value creation opportunity out of this is around decision optimization. I use the word optimization cautiously. 10 years ago, we would use data to say, yeah, this business case looks like a good business case, or I've done my due diligence, it seems reasonable. In a world of massive data, what you can do very easily, trivially in a lot of cases, is you can build a bespoke big data set. You can aggregate a load of external market sources, and then you can use machine learning so that you're not doing is this a good or bad investment choice? You're able to say, well, across all possible permutations, what's the optimum investment choice? And if you look at something like a property company or an asset-intensive company, those high-value recurrent decisions are quite prevalent. So another very, very good way in. And then the bit that gets all the sexy pizzazz and marketing is, how do I become a generative AI agent-driven company? And I would say there are ways, it is worth exploring, but be extremely cautious because of the issues, and we'll talk about them next slide,
Yeah.
about data security and a few other things, novel risks.
As you mentioned, data is the crux of AI, and having a lot of data available to you is a much more efficient way. But if you're looking at a portfolio of differing companies, differing industries, challenges, opportunities, how can you really personalize your approach to each portco?
That's a great question. I think it's probably worth answering by saying you'd be surprised at how little of your own data you need to get value.
Okay.
If you are going to build a big data model, you can go to market and either free or for pennies, and sometimes for more than that, you can buy or access data sets. And if you're intelligent about what data sets you're using, you can infer an awful lot of information without spending big money at all. Example, COVID lockdowns, doing some work with a property company, and two data sources proved enormously valuable. Their question was, I'm looking at rental tenants, which ones will make it, and therefore I probably want to discount to keep the tenant, and which retail companies are cooked anyway, so there's no point trying to discount because they're going to fold. And the combination of Google Maps data, which shows footfall and therefore effectively is a proxy for how busy is this retail location, and scraping company presentations, so things like quarterly accounts or company accounts, aggregating those two data sources, which is all publicly available data, was utterly transformative in trying to work out which of their retail customers was a, relatively speaking, sound investment to think about discounting to in a really turbulent market over lockdown. Of course, what you need is a little bit of your own data to seed that. But if you have, at portco level, if you have a huge exposure to a particular market, let's say you've got retail heavy, you could, at each different company level, build a data model and use that to take decisions. Or you could do that on an aggregate basis. And that's a choice you've got to make because there's a whole load of risk governance and other things going on in there. But you're going to want for retail, good quality location, retail, customer, potentially things like crime data. And in each case, if we drew this to scale, the market data would be the size of Jupiter and the my data would be the size of a tiny little rock orbiting Jupiter, not even a moon. The amount of data out there is astonishing. But in a very niche sense, you can also generate your own data. I've been involved with a case where a massive software business had several hundred million pricing data points. The trouble is all of them were the same because they historically had used one price point. And so we created something called a reinforcement learning algorithm, which is how modern chess computers learn to play. And effectively the algorithm simulated tens of millions of customer interactions to come up with a model, effectively synthetic data. And we use the term synthetic data a lot, particularly in healthcare, sometimes in financial services, where the information you want to use to drive decision making is not very easy to use because of data security and privacy. And there's a variety of ways we can use synthetic data. In fact, there's an awful lot of synthetic data available on the market. You can get things like synthetic genomics data for population segments, which when you think about it is completely mind-blowing. So if you want to do anything, you can go into the market, see what data exists, and start from the question, what do I have? How do I combine that to infer things I would gain value from? And then let's do a test case. Okay, that passed muster. Let's go to the next level of automation. But I think the really interesting problem this creates is one of privacy. And there's a couple of other things we'll talk about, prompt injection risks and a few other things in a moment. But if I think about my own personal data as an individual, the moment I post anything on social media, I cannot think of that as private anymore. During the very early days, actually, of the Ukraine war, I had a conversation with a data scraping company based in Ukraine on behalf of a client who had about 10 million customer email addresses. And we said, look, we're not going to do it because we're really worried about the ethics. And we didn't do it. But out of interest, if we give you 4 large social media platforms, Insta, for instance, and others that you will know, what hit rate will you have, do you think, based on those email addresses, to find us accounts, and how much will it cost us for you to scrape those accounts and give us the aggregate? And their view was about $150K to take 10 million email addresses, probably a 20% hit rate, give or take, and deliver up the social profile of those people. Now, if you think about that from a customer insight perspective, That is mind-blowingly huge. I think what is missing in most cases is leadership teams and PE teams understanding of how big these opportunities are. Yes, there are real ethical and privacy issues, but from a company perspective, from a personal perspective, what we were doing with social media was telling the world who we smile when we're stood next to, where we like to go on holiday, what brands we have affiliations with through our Facebook account. What we're now finding is a pretty invidious thing happening where if you've got a load of people in your company who happen to be using, I don't know, OpenAI or Google Gemini for personal use to drive up their productivity, it's pretty easy for the AI company to make inferences. Oh, look, at this office, at this time, there's a sudden spike in people asking questions about this issue. That leaks a huge amount of insight to the market, and I don't think most companies are aware of how much information they're leaking to the AI providers, with or without corporate permission. And all of the kind of big global compliance-driven companies, things like global banks, very early came in very hard and said, thou shalt not use any AI tool as an individual for anything to do with work.
Very interesting, and slightly scary stuff as well. Moving on then to Gen AI, obviously a lot of hype around it at the moment, a lot of clients talking about it, implementing it into their strategy as well. What do you think is the best way to correctly harness generative AI?
That's a great question, isn't it? It's a huge amount of money rides on that. I think it depends. It's the annoying answer. I think there are 3 routes in to generative AI. By far and away the easiest route to get value quickly from generative AI is to have individuals in the company or in the team using it on a personal basis. So what I've got is a chart on a page here. It's really easy to use AI and generative AI if you have a low data maturity. It then gets really hard, and then it gets easy again. And highly mature data organizations find it very, very easy to strap in the next tool and gain value from it. The bit in the middle is the problem. So if I wanted to quickly get results from AI, I would probably use publicly available tools for things like marketing. And there's a lot out there that allows you to curate the data and think about segmentation, customer segmentation, and then tailor content to different customers by group. And you can do that manually. You can say that I've got a particular customer segment that looks like this. Could you take this standard corporate, marketing idea, and could you reinvent it for that audience? Whether that's redrafting wording or whether it's creating images now, which are phenomenal, photorealistic. And of course, now what we've got is immediately video realistic movie clips. So if you want to generate brand impact, you can simply write a few clicks, and actually you can use Gen AI to help you develop the prompts, generate video, and send it to people. That's really accessible, really easy. But the more as a business you start to use that, you move from that individual augmentation on the screen down into this sort of trough of trouble, the intelligent automation space. Because what you want to do is you want to take those individual actions and strap them together. And unfortunately, the AI is simply not good enough to work unsupervised, generative AI today. So you've got to keep the human in the loop. And if you start strapping AI bits of process together into a longer automated process, you start to find that unless you're very careful, unless your data maturity is high, you start to leak an awful lot of data out. The alternatives, and I've already touched on, and we'll talk again in a moment about personalization and about optimizing investment decision making. The third alternative is essentially leapfrogging that maturity thing and sort of aggressively, what once we would have called transformational outsourcing now becomes transformational insourcing. You go to a tech partner and you say, I know you've got all the capability to do this. Can you attach your electrodes to my business and show me what you can do? I'm very nervous about that because the tech whiz very rarely understands the business well enough. And most businesses actually don't understand themselves well enough to ask the right questions. Nevertheless, it's a valid path. And I would say in most cases, I would start with both personalization, which you can do manually actually without too much big data stuff going on. And I would start with decision optimization before I get too excitable about Gen AI. And I would allow specific groups of my workforce attached to specific problem areas to experiment on a personal basis and start to use Gen AI for themselves, driving up their productivity, partly because you'll lose them if you don't let them do that, because they'll want to go to a competitor who's a more permissive, sexy, cool workplace policy. If you become too risk averse in this stuff, there's a lovely balancing act between protecting against certain risks that you don't want exposure to, and challenging yourself, really taking enough commercial risk as we chase this stuff. So this slide shows the three options. I've talked about them already, and what I suggest we do is talk about them all in turn, sort of 60, 90 seconds on each. So we, 25 years ago, had a really standard kind of old school process automation approach, which was driven by shared services and tech outsourcing, which was you took a process, you standardized it, you simplified it, you automated it, and you shared it. And for a lot of very unexciting processes like invoice matching, it works really well, because you can do a zillion of these a month or a week or a year, and they all are supposed to be standard and the same, and that's great. Brilliant, you've cut out a lot of cost. The benefits from doing that were typically 30-50% unit economies of scale, particularly if we start to use offshoring, and some of the labour arbitrage got that sort of 70% cost reduction. Really worth having, but very old school. And the problem that gives us in the world of AI is very monolithic processes. Everything is standardised, controls are standardised, and therefore you can't personalise. Personalisation instead, yes, it's an AI-enabled capability, but it starts by making a business model change. The first thing you've got to do is what I've called here atomize the process. Great example would be doom scrolling on social media. The process, when you are consuming YouTube or Insta content, is effectively the algorithm is saying, what's the next video I serve up in front of your eyes to keep you on the screen? Because the longer I can keep you on the screen, the more I can monetize. And some videos have monetary value, paid ads, and some don't. So there's an algorithm going on there. It's taken an atomized process. So in years gone by, we'd spend 10 quid, 15 quid, 20 quid to go and buy a video, a DVD, a Blu-ray, and we'd sit down and we'd watch a movie for 2 hours. We might well spend, or certainly my teenage kids might well spend 2 hours watching YouTube, but it's not one choice. It's a complete atomization of that video journey into little bite-sized chunks. The second thing that's going on is that there is an analysis of the audience. What segment are you? So Hugo, do you particularly like, I don't know, cars, wine, whatever it may be? How do we therefore serve up a piece of content that's going to keep you engaged? How do we serve up a piece of content that's going to monetize that? And that's a very personalized piece of context, segmentation analysis and similar. And so at the heart of this, when it's done at scale and at pace, is an automation engine that decides what's the next best action, what's the next piece of content, what's the next action in the customer journey. We then deliver that, review that. Did we get the result we thought? Oh no, it's interesting. When we played this video to people like Hugo, actually 75% of them switched off. Okay, that's an interesting piece of knowledge. Let's learn from that and adapt. And that personalization sort of network of actions is linked because you've got an awful lot of algorithmic decisions going on, feedback loops. And the more you can have quick feedback loops, the quicker the thing can learn and adapt. But the good news is you don't have to be a data scientist or data rocket scientist to be able to go there. Your marketing team typically already has some customer segmentation information. You've already got some data around, customer pain points or staff pain points or supplier pain points or whatever else it may be. So you can start that process manually and then look at individual parts of it and take a little risk on a small part and say, well, let's try and do an algorithm in there instead of a manual thing. Let's augment the person and start, 10x, 100x the speed and the acuity of that decision. And when this stuff is done well, and I think this is the really striking part, we don't get 30, 50, 70% benefits. We get orders of magnitude change. Probably the nerdiest example I can give you is at the front end of drug discovery, a sort of knowledge-based task, working with a very well-known pharma major, where the process time, by sticking in something called a data graph and doing some clever things, the cycle time was reduced by 1,000 times, from 3 months to kind of 10 minutes. And the quality of output was improved 1,000 times. So is that a 2,000 or 1,000,000 times improvement in... And look, this is a major pharmaceutical firm who weren't bad at this beforehand, but the idea that that key step in drug discovery just got 1,000 times quicker and 1,000 times better. From an investment and return perspective, it's not, oh, I get it, I think I want one. It's, no, hang on, this is a totally different planet compared to the kind of tech automation we used to do. So for me, This is always a brilliant conversation to have, because if the business doesn't understand its customer segmentation or its staff segmentation or its suppliers or its SKUs, stock keeping unit or asset segmentation, there's immediate value from just doing a spreadsheet exercise.
Yeah.
And the moment you've got that first bit of value, there's immediate value in going the next step, the next step, the next step. Whether the value of a step is worth the investment in that step, well, that's a good conversation to have. But this is a great place to start.
Definitely, and I think personalization is definitely one of the most exciting topics. I think as consumers we're seeing that largely over the last few years. So just diving in then to the next slide.
Well, before you do, yes, you're right. Personalization is a huge topic. I think a key message to PE owners, to investors, and to management teams is don't just think of personalization in terms of the customer experience. You can personalize for staff, you can personalize for stock, you can personalize for assets. This is a tool set with massive wider applicability than the common use. And the most common use is let's personalize our marketing. Great, I mean, that's really good. It's a great place to start. But if that's where you stop, you're missing a trick. Transformational insourcing is probably the most interesting one to your question in terms of Gen AI adoption. The vibe out there, the marketed vibe, is AI is good enough now to come and replace people. Let's use agents. In most cases, that is simply not true. Effectively, we've got an autocomplete capability, a large language model, for instance. We've trained it on the internet and spent unbelievable amounts of electricity and time to make sure it's really good at being a really good autocomplete. But that is not, despite all the claims, that is not human intelligence. That is not, and we are in serious danger of saying the computer is thinking in these models. And therefore, anything seriously risk-bearing, don't trust an LLM. It's a massively useful tool set to augment your team. And the question is therefore, how do we take these generative AI capabilities and augment our team? How do we do this agent thing? The approach to take is not, I'm going to have a completely virtual workforce. Not yet. Probably not for a couple of generations of tech. It's, imagine I have a manager with 10, 100, 1,000 people working underneath them. How do I 10x? How do I 100x the productivity of that team? So look, top tips, key takeaways. The opportunity from AI is immense, but there are quite a lot of heffalump traps and pitfalls. So start small and get expert advice. Get a really clear view of the things that will align with what you're trying to do as an organization. Excite the employees, excite the customers with what you're trying to do. If you say to everyone AI is going to take your jobs, they'll resist it. If you say, look, this is a really cool thing that's going to make us do something amazing in the marketplace that people be talking about, that's going to excite them. That's going to load the dice towards your success. But then break it down, iterate. Pick something small to start with. Learn, use that proof of concept approach. And I've used some phrases on the page: value at risk, keep it small, and time to value, keep it quick. Deliver things, small things, fast, and learn from them. And invariably, the amount of tech and data capability beyond the organizational perimeter is vastly higher than you will ever hire or hold. So partner, and think really astutely, commercially, about which partner and how you're going to incentivize them so you get the right team working for you, aligned with purpose. And always, and this really ought to be a board topic, are we taking enough risk? Are we making enough running at the commercial opportunity of AI? Are we putting down enough risk capital? Are we investing enough cash flow? And at the other side, what are the risks we're never going to take? We're never going to risk our customer data. Okay, what does that constrain us in? What are the other risks we're never going to take? And that, I would recommend, should be a live board topic every meeting. And certainly when sitting down and looking at the business strategy, are we taking enough risk to drive AI? And what are the risks we will never take with our data? Are things that should always be part of the strategy conversation, in my view.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much, Al. It's been really eye-opening for me. I'm sure very, very eye-opening for the listeners as well. As I said before, it is an ongoing conversation. So if you are listening and you would like to be part of that conversation, please do reach out. But as I said, thank you again, Al.